The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and today we tackle your questions, including could Max Verstappen's lack of wheel-to-wheel competition blunt him in battle, and what Hamilton knew before the start of the season to convince him to sign for Ferrari. I'm Edd Straw, and joining us with all the answers are Josh Suttill and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Scott, welcome back. You're not long back from Suzuka, as the yawn you've just deployed in your introduction attests to.
Yeah, I at least managed to. I stifled it, so hopefully it didn't get caught on the mic. I don't feel too bad. As we sit and record this now, I've been home for 27 hours, which means I've been home, as of right now, I have been home for less time than it took me to get home, having left the hotel in Scirocco near the circuit. It's a long journey back from Suzuka, partly because most of the flights back to Europe only commence on Monday evening, and you get booted out the media hotel pretty early, so you have about 12 hours kicking around before you even start flying.
Well worth it for Suzuka, though, isn't it? It's any amount of time in the air is justified for that place. And Josh, as well, you weren't in Japan, but you have been working flat out. You seem to have been working 24/7 over the past week with this strange time zone race for you.
Yeah, more or less. I've been on that kind of Japan-Australia time for the past few weeks, and that will continue for one more round, and then probably get back onto a bit more of a normal schedule from... Is it Miami after that? So
yeah. So no. You go the other way, don't you, for that one?
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, eventually we'll get to Imola, and it'll be a relatively normal time zone. But yeah, it's been a busy season. Of course, China we've got coming up the weekend after this. And today we're going to make this episode purely about listener questions. As always, we get loads of questions from the Race Members Club, and we've just got so many, it's worth us visiting some of them in the week as well, because we can't get through all of them on the post-race podcast. And to find out more about the membership, check out the link in the description of this episode. Head to therace.com as well. Don't forget the hyphen if you're going there. And remember, you can also sign up via Apple Podcasts. Now, this season, we haven't actually dedicated too much time to talking about Max Verstappen, simply because he's been doing his job so well that just as last year, he's almost making the extraordinary boring. So our first question is on him. Josh, we'll aim this at you first. This is from Kay Lois, who says, is there any mileage in the argument that the more races Max goes without any real challenge in terms of his driving against other cars, the more difficult it will become if and when he is challenged in a wheel-to-wheel fight? If you don't have to fight for your place, can you lose confidence or skill in those areas?
I'd have concerns over other drivers, but I have absolutely zero concerns over Max Verstappen. You know, one of the best wheel-to-wheel drivers on the grid. And even on the occasions where we've seen him have to race at the front, you think to Las Vegas last year, he was still really sharp there. There were a couple of incidents, but that was mainly because of turn one, and the second one was mainly because of George Russell. So, you know, I don't see any issue there. because of the fact you've also got to consider is that he is still racing at the front and he is still overtaking, just in the virtual world where he always has been honing his skills. You think back to his rookie season, that famous overtake at Spa, the one on Felipe Nasr that he practiced in the virtual world and deployed just the same in real life. He's carried on doing that, since then, and still regularly, competes in sim racing and keeps his skills sharp in the virtual world. So there's absolutely no problem when it gets to the real stuff.
I think it depends on the context of the wider context in which these battles are taking place and what kind of challenge he has in that race situation as well. So in isolation, Max is, as Josh said, fantastic in wheel to wheel, and he has still been overtaking people in the last couple of years. A couple of his wins that stand out in the mind, like the drive back through for the victory at Spa in 22, Miami last year when he was out of position on the grid there. He's had plenty, but one of the key things is it's been coming at a time where obviously the car's been dominant. Now that doesn't make it easy, because that I know is an assumption many people will make. It was the same when Lewis Hamilton was dominating for Mercedes, but there is a skill set to recover. Even if you've got the fastest car, you can be out of position on the grid, you can have a bad first lap and lose places, you can suffer some kind of strategic misstep during the race, or there can be an ill-timed safety car that costs you track position, whatever it is. And a combination of patience, good judgment, ruthlessness where required, it is what needs to come together to then regain position. Now, there was a time in Max's career, and it wasn't even right at the start, it was a few years in, where he was still struggling to work out that blend of patience and aggression. You think of 2018 and the famous run of incidents early on there. But he improved that over that season and again in 19, to the point where in 2020, when the Red Bull was comfortably the second fastest car, Verstappen was racing with a different mindset. There was more patience in the way he went about things. His skill set had evolved and become a little bit more rounded. He knew how to overtake and how to race with a faster car than almost everybody around him, especially faster than the people he was trying to overtake. He's got very, very good at that. His judgment on that is spectacular and very, very efficient and very effective. Where I would have not necessarily a question mark, but where I think it is valid to ask exactly how good Verstappen is at this and how much not racing in this way for a couple of years might impact things is we've seen him in the really high pressure scenarios in a single race, but also over a championship, like in 2021, that aggression and judging the line becomes harder, and Max can cross that line quite easily. And that's when he gets into incidents that he doesn't need to be getting into. Even after 2021, the one with Hamilton in Brazil, for example, through turns 1 and 2, they were both both as bad as each other to a degree, in that you could tell that they were going to have a crash just by the way the body language of the cars. But that's the kind of thing that Verstappen can't help but get drawn into sometimes, and that would be the area where I think, is that something that he could potentially get caught out on in the future?
Yeah, that's more just the sort of general trend, isn't it? I remember certainly looking at the end of 21, Saudi Arabia, for example, he just overdid things a little bit, trying to get past at every opportunity. But I don't think he's going to lose any confidence or skill. I can't imagine Max Verstappen losing confidence, and he's hugely skillful. So he's got skill to spare. He could probably lose 10% of his skill and still be mega, to be quite honest. So yeah, I am interested to see what happens next time he gets into a real head-to-head fight.
And it depends with who, right? If it's with Charles Leclerc over a season, I think that's going to remain quite fair and reasonable. If it's with Lewis Hamilton or George Russell, I think there's more potential there for a few more fireworks. It seems like it does depend on who he's racing. That has quite a big impact on how he drives and races and the likelihood of him crossing that line.
Yeah, you're right. There is some history there, although, as often happens with any driver in a title fight, things can be quite good between drivers until they aren't. So I'm interested to see how a Verstappen-Leclerc thing would play out. Hopefully we'll get to see that in the future. That would be fantastic. Let's move on now, Scott, to a question from Mark Beanland, who says, when Lewis Hamilton announced his move to Ferrari, there was speculation that this was a vote of no confidence in Mercedes, and it seems that with their performance thus far, this could have been a shrewd decision. However, what might he have seen at the factory to make him feel this way, especially as I would assume that the engineers would all be saying how great the car would be?
if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, it's certainly of what was explained to us. I don't believe Lewis had driven the car in the sim, the 2024 Mercedes in the sim, when he made his Ferrari decision. I think he would also, roughly working out the timeline, I think he might have already made that decision before he even did his seat fit as well. So if you think about where he was at the end of 23, the way he was talking, he knew the development direction. He knew what Mercedes was seeing virtually. We've now seen a few races in that there are some issues between what Mercedes has been seeing virtually versus how it's actually running in reality. That is actually quite consistent with the last couple of years, when it obviously has been badly surprised by how little its real-world car reflects the simulations. So I don't think there was anything on the Mercedes side that worried Hamilton or made him think, actually, no, they're not going to get this right. I need to leave. Not specifically to this car, because I don't think there was anything over the winter that was any real different to what Mercedes has experienced the last couple of years. There would have been a lot of positivity. There would have been a lot of optimism that they'd have got on top of their issues and identified it. He even said at the end of last year in an interview that our own Mark Hughes was in, that Mercedes had found its North Star in terms of development. So I don't think it was anything. I don't think it was a push factor away from Mercedes. It was the pull factors from Ferrari got revived or improved. We know that Ferrari had been courting him in private for a while. I suspect once the season finally ended and Hamilton kind of paused, reflected on where he was at, bought into the Ferrari vision again, got given a very, very good monetary offer alongside everything else, he just decided that the time was right for a change. But I suspect it was more about what he could get out of the move than what he would get by leaving, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right that the pull factors were significant there, although I don't believe he'd have moved if he didn't believe that Ferrari was at least going to be as promising as Mercedes, if not more so. So I think that played a part, but I don't necessarily think it would have been the winter progress. I think it would have just been the realisation of, we've had 2 years of this now, are we really going to see a change? I don't necessarily know. So I think it was, as you say, it definitely wasn't, I've got to get out of here, where can I go? But I think there will have been a certain chipping away of the confidence in Mercedes that's played a part in this, because I think if Hamilton was certain they'd be really strong this year and potentially a championship contender in 25, I'm not sure he'd have made the same decision.
No, well, that's what allows, I think, the doubt to creep in. So I think that's why the pull factors at Ferrari become relevant, because there were pull factors. There've been pull factors at Ferrari for forever. Maybe not to the same degree, and certainly with the trajectory it's been on for some time, you could argue that this is the most convincing it's been. But it was winning races at the start of 2022, and it was clearly better than Mercedes and Red Bull's nearest challenger. So there have been plenty of times where Ferrari has looked like it's a very serious prospect from a competitiveness point of view. So no, I agree, and I definitely wouldn't want to downplay that Hamilton had reasons to leave Mercedes. I mean it more as I don't believe the winter threw up any new push factors away from Mercedes. I feel like the doubts by that point had crept in significantly to open the door, and then it was about, right, how appealing is a move elsewhere? Because you do need someone to still come in with a very, very good offer, because it was bad and disappointing, but not disastrous. And like I say, the way that things were at by the end of 2023, there would have at least been some optimism that Mercedes would turn it around, if not in the first year, then the second year of that 1+1 contract.
Yeah, and I do wonder if the fact that things at the end of 23 didn't go quite as hoped as well, that full stall at Cota and the disqualification and the struggles after that, all of this will have played a part in his decision. And connected to that question, we've got one I'll take from Alexander Dallendorfer, who says, has Lewis Hamilton given up on both this season and Mercedes already? Well, you could argue by definition he has given up on Mercedes, given what we've just discussed, but I don't believe he's given up on 24. I still get the impression he's keen to sign off with a good season, however reduced those ambitions for that may be compared to the glory years, because he was genuinely upbeat at the end of Saturday at Suzuka. Very down after the race. That's because it's one that got away from him with that bit of damage, the aborted one-stopper, etc. And I don't think you can take Hamilton's rather unresponsive and very subdued body language and words after a bad session or race as a sign of that or anything, because even in the good times, that would happen when things hadn't gone well. It takes him time to process it. He very much wears his heart on his sleeve in that regard. So I would imagine there could be a time towards the end of the season when he's got one eye firmly on the Ferrari move if the Mercedes isn't competitive. And there's almost a subconscious loss of that edge, even if he doesn't sit there and think, oh, all right, I'm checking out now. It's just the way the psychology can work. But I think that's a very long way off. And there's a sincere desire, I think, to try and find a win in that farewell season and end on a relative high. I don't think he's cruising by any stretch of the imagination.
He wouldn't have been the faster Mercedes driver through the Japan weekend. And obviously Russell did a better job in the race and beat Lewis on merit, I think, in the Grand Prix. But you wouldn't have that sort of Friday, Saturday superiority to the point where I don't really think Russell was ever really a threat to beat Hamilton over a single lap. And I think Lewis had a couple attempts on him at Suzuka. Like, that doesn't happen if he's checked out completely. I can absolutely believe that there are moments where the head drops a little bit, and as you say, it's more of a subconscious thing than a conscious thing. There's a decent percentage of that will just be competitive. You alluded to that as well, Ed. I think every driver can go through those moments where it just gets a little bit tricky, especially when you feel like you're just repeating the same cycle over and over again. But I feel like there are still plenty enough peaks to show that Hamilton is ready to turn on the old magic, so to speak, as long as he feels he's got the car there. And when he doesn't have the car there, it just feels a little bit of, oh God, here we go again.
Well, he was absolutely delighted after Saturday in Japan. You know, once he had that feeling back, he's suddenly absolutely on it. And then, unfortunately, it only takes like the race on Sunday for it to go the other way, and that's why people maybe get the impression that he's checked out. But that can change, like Ed said, on such a dime. But it might be the next qualifying session. Once again, he's absolutely delighted.
Yeah, and I think you might see at the end of the season something. For example, Valtteri Bottas. Remember Abu Dhabi 2021? He wasn't really at the races. He was very sixth that weekend because really Mercedes thing was over for him. He had his eyes on the Sauber move.
Well, almost like when Hamilton used to win the title with a few races to spare and have that kind of end of the season run where he wasn't quite at 100%, maybe even a couple of percent off. I think that's what we'll see, but that won't be until the very last few races.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think all the evidence is that he still wants to end well. I certainly don't think he's given up on this season. It would be pretty difficult if you give up on it in April. But we'll see how he goes. I think that desire just to get one last win, as difficult as that might seem at the moment, will really be burning there. And that means on weekends when the car's good, we might see some special performances from him.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month slows. Full terms at mintmobile.com.
Right, let's move on to our next batch of questions now. Josh, one for you from Joe Graham. Lawrence Stroll has promised he'd create an Aston Martin team that would be ruthless about winning. Will he ever fire Lance Stroll then?
I don't think that Aston Martin can win the World Constructors' Championship with Lance Stroll in that team unless there is a significant increase in Stroll's progress, and I think he's had long enough in F1 to show that that's not really coming down the tracks. And the only other way is if Aston Martin has a Red Bull-like advantage at the front of the field, which again is probably unlikely. You'd obviously say 26 is the best hope of that. But without either of those things, I can't see him winning the Constructors' Championship. You could argue whoever's alongside Stroll could win the Drivers' Championship in the right car, but that's not going to be Stroll himself. So he is unfortunately a liability points-wise and will continue to be. So some difficult conversations have to be had there. I don't believe he will fire his own son, but probably what's more likely is a conversation between the two of them about what Lance wants to do going forward, whether he's still getting everything he wants to from F1. I think there's sometimes a misconception that he doesn't enjoy racing in F1 just because you see a couple of sort of Mardy post-qualifying or race interviews. I don't think that's the case. I think, like many other drivers, he doesn't particularly enjoy some of the stuff off track, but on track he's a racer and he really enjoys racing and driving in F1. So yeah, it's a question of whether Lance wants to continue and whether the team steps in. The sports cars is obviously an area where he could be directed towards, but that will be a case of whether that satisfies what Lance wants from what Lance is getting from F1. Can he get that in sports cars? That's a different question. But for now, if they're properly serious about winning championships, they're not going to do that with Stroll in the team.
There's also a Lance Stroll question for you, Scott, from Thomas Knight, who says, are Lance Stroll's qualifying woes at a circuit with fast sequences of corners such as Suzuka, Jeddah and Losail due to struggles with the current generation of cars, or something to do with his technique? He has done fine at Bahrain and Melbourne this year, in stark contrast.
Yes, it's a good question, actually. I'm not 100% convinced there is a... I don't know if correlation equals causation in this case, because one, I think every one of those situations obviously has different specifics around it, whether it's the weekend format, whether it's other conditions like track temperature or ambient temperature, the relative competitiveness of the car shifts as well. That's obviously something that you can't just dismiss. It might well be that there is something in Stroll's technique that means he's more vulnerable to the kind of swings that a circuit like that can produce. For example, when you have a sector like Sector 1 at Suzuka or Sector 1 at Jeddah, for example, as another case study, Qatar is another good one, given just how many medium and high speed corners, medium speed in particular, that circuit has. They all flow one to the next, and it doesn't take much. If you're slightly uncomfortable in the car or you make one mistake, it compounds. So it might not be like an inherent struggle every single time, but it can be that in crunch moments, one small mistake or just a tiny little bit of bleeding lap time corner to corner to corner causes that drop off. One thing that is clear is that the inconsistency or erraticness of the performances shows an underlying weakness of some kind. That is just fact. And the problem is that Stroll's peaks are also the peaks are fine, but they're never like head-turningly, wow, if this guy did this every single week in, week out, or just did this more often than not, he'd be an absolute top-class driver. Stroll's peak is to be just a bit behind Alonso, I think. If Alonso was at his best, his peak, if Alonso slightly underperforms, is that Stroll can genuinely beat him. We have seen that a couple of times in their stint as teammates. But yeah, it's frustrating because the good moments, whether that is in pure speed or in racecraft, because I still maintain on the opening lap or in battle, he can be fantastic to watch. He pulled off some lovely moves in the S's, for example, around Suzuka, and you can't do that if you're inherently a bad driver. You have to have some innate level of ability there, and his car control and judgment tends to be very good in those situations. But it's just a shame that those moments, those good moments, are so often offset by weekends where he just goes missing.
Yeah, and he has had some good showings at those sorts of circuits. He had a 6th place at Qatar a few years ago. Wasn't stunning in qualifying that weekend, but not too bad. I do think Suzuka's a tricky one for him, and I think it connects to what you were talking about there, Scott. He is a little bit imprecise as a driver, I think. It's one of my complaints about Stroll in that I don't feel he's refined his ability to the nth degree, because I think although Josh Eddy enjoys it, I'm not sure he lives and breathes it and absorbs it and is just absolutely wringing every last thing out of himself in every way. And I think at a track like Suzuka, that will hurt you. And Suzuka, I would say there is a pretty good body of evidence that that's a little bit of a weak track for him if you look at his qualifying performances there over the years.
That imprecision is in his technique, isn't it? Because the precision in the moments where it's basically on sort of like instinct and gut feeling is fantastic. In those, in the wet,
he's really good
in
starts,
first laps,
in the wet, all those sorts of things. Yeah.
And that's the but it's precision in a different way. It's a different element that is putting it under. And I do think that when it comes down to that pure driving technique, I think you're right. I think there is just something there that's missing, and I don't know. It's impossible to say on the outside whether it's commitment, whether it's a limit in understanding. I don't want to say intelligence because it conveys the wrong thing, but you know what I mean. Whether it is just he would have to think too consciously about the kind of thing that you can't think about consciously in an F1 car. There is just something there that's not that is missing.
Yeah, there's certainly ability in Stroll. That's not ever been the problem. The question marks lie elsewhere for me. The next question now I'll take is from Michael Egermont, who says, what can the 9 teams behind Red Bull do to stay more consistent from track to track? It seems that most teams have inconsistent performance. Well, it's an interesting question because, yeah, you can argue the pack behind is inconsistent while Red Bull is consistently in the front. But you do also have to remember that Red Bull has a dominant car. It's on a different planet on a decent weekend for Red Bull, and it's still generally the best on a bad one. Singapore last year, I guess, being the outlier from that over the past couple of seasons. But Red Bull always looks super consistent because it's the reference. So you don't really see the swings, the backs and forths so much with Red Bull because they always look like they're at the front. And then you have that group behind it that's a lot more condensed. And Aston Martin and Mercedes are a good example because on average outright pace, the pace deficit for Aston Martin's about 0.6% and for Mercedes is about 0.75%. And within that, there's swings. So if one's at a track where they're a tenth or two stronger and the other is weaker, that flips the positions. And then you've got the question of driver delivery at Suzuka. Alonso was only ahead of the Mercedes drivers thanks to that combination of him nailing qualifying, the Mercedes drivers underachieving, and then the way their strategy played out. And there's all these kinds of swings going on everywhere through the pack. So I wouldn't necessarily say the performance of the cars is excessively inconsistent. But having said that, it's true to say that with this generation of cars, we do see some specific characteristics and tendencies that amplify that inconsistency because McLaren, for example, their competitiveness very clearly waxes and wanes with how many long, slow corners there are and the percentage of DRS. So within that, there are also inconsistencies born of the difficulties in extracting that consistent performance across a wide range of corner speed profiles and characteristics and challenges. And yeah, ultimately, if you're at the front, it's easier to be consistent because you'll often always be at the front. But I'm not sure Red Bull is any more or less inconsistent than sort of the mean inconsistency. I don't know whether anyone would agree or disagree on that.
Well, I think we've seen times, haven't we, where when it falls out the window quite spectacularly. That's more been the case in the last couple of seasons than this season. Although this season, maybe that's because we just haven't had enough of a sample set of tracks. But Melbourne didn't seem as vulnerable as it's looked. For example, last year, he says, referencing the race in which that both cars had a nightmare and that they didn't get a 1-2 finish, but you know what I mean in terms of raw performance, getting the lap in qualifying, etc., etc. So I think it's more just that Red Bull's had moments where its inconsistency is born out of the difference between that car in its sweet spot and it not in its sweet spot. I think the others are kind of like, if in the last 2.5 or 2 and a bit years now, the difference between Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Aston Martin at different times through that period between being in the sweet spot and out of the sweet spot is whether they're second best or fifth best, Whereas with Red Bull, it's the difference between being fastest and untroubled and all of a sudden being on the second or third row, or in, what absolute worst case scenario, Singapore, where you have Verstappen not even being able to make it into Q3. So I think it just creates a more aggressive swing because of the standard that we're used to them being at.
The difference we're seeing this year is that Ferrari is quite clearly the second fastest car. So I think you might be seeing less swings for who is the second best team. But I think that's slightly more to do with what Ed said in terms of the pace of the car. I think it's because they've established a bit better of a more clear fastest second fastest car compared to those around them, and also obviously an element of them reducing a bit of the peakiness of that car as well, which I think is inevitable the further you get into a regulation cycle.
Yeah, and you'd say that Ferrari's pretty much the second best car. McLaren's been pretty much the third best car. Generally, Aston Martin and Mercedes tend to go back and forth. The Aston Martin's a bit more consistent within what it does. The Mercedes is a bit more erratic. And I think you'd probably pick RB as a fairly clear sixth best car over the season so far. So, yeah, there are some interesting patterns developing. But ultimately, there's always going to be some of that inconsistency because you'll always design your car with certain objectives that will vary from team to team, just slightly in terms of the biases and the considerations. And then within that, how well you deliver on those creates another compounding factor of that erraticness. So, yeah, it's kind of a sum of all of those inputs. Josh, a question from Jamie Stark now, who says, with the Suzuka qualifying showing that the field is indeed tighter to the Red Bull compared to last year, what tracks might they be vulnerable at?
Yeah, so I can't see them being too vulnerable at Shanghai. The only thing that might trip them up is the sprint format. So, yeah, there's a potential banana skin there, but I think Red Bull will be strong there. I'd say the next best bet is probably Miami. That's what Carlos Sainz pointed to. I think there's a bit of a potential there for a bit of a Ferrari challenge. It was, Red Bull had the advantage there last year, but that could have been, I think, reduced this year. Then you're probably looking at, obviously, Singapore is the very, very obvious one, but also Monza, obviously, where Ferrari had a strong challenge last year. So I think we will see them being vulnerable at certain tracks. Australia was proof of that. Really frustrating, actually. We didn't get a proper straight fight between Verstappen and Sainz. I'd have really liked to see that, but I think we will see that later in the season, and our first bet at that, like I say, is probably Miami.
Next question for you, Scott, comes from Andreas Hjalmarsson, who says, is Ferrari's strategy back on track now? Or is it just down to trying to maximise their results and not attempting to perform heroics with a less competitive car?
I assume that Andreas's question is referring to strategy as in specifically in-race strategy rather than the broader kind of
that's how I took it. Yeah. I think we're talking actual race strategy, not management speak.
Yes. Okay. Great. I understand, and apologies if that sounded patronising to Andreas. I just wanted to make sure I was answering the question correctly. Because
also that's just my interpretation of it. I could be completely wrong, but that asterisk is against everything I say. So.
Maybe we're both just going to be idiots. But Andreas can just write in again and correct us and just say no. Now answer my actual question. I think there are two elements here. I don't want to use the cliched it's a bit of both, but it is a bit of both to a degree, because I do think under Vasseur that is a slightly more assured organisation. I think he has tried to streamline the communication so that they can make decisions quicker and make it a bit easier to understand who is making the decision rather than being a bit too drawn out. Obviously, Vasseur came from a much smaller, more streamlined Sauber team. And came into a Ferrari organisation that was, I suspect, slightly bloated in terms of the way that it actually had to manage race strategy and make some of its decisions. So I think that specifically has been a help. Then I think when you look at the performance of the car, I think that has just made things a lot more straightforward. I don't know if it was necessarily that they were trying to perform heroics before, but I think sometimes before they were just trying to race cars that were just inherently a little bit quicker. And better with tyre management as well, because I think there were elements of aerodynamic inconsistency, whether those were small aerodynamic stalls or whatever at the rear of the car, where the rear tyres in particular would just be worked a little bit extra. That in itself is probably multiple factors, and I've just named two of them: the aerodynamic tendencies of the car plus the fact that it wasn't quite as quick. So when you're then so they're then minded to push harder to keep up with a Red Bull that's running at 90% in the opening stint or 95% or whatever, and other teams at times as well. I think it was Carlos Sainz who said at Suzuka that they had no flexibility on strategy before because there wasn't actually anything that they could do performance-wise. I think now you've got a better team across the board, but you've also got a better car. So I think that they can just pull things off that they couldn't do previously because they've actually just got that little bit they can say, okay, well, we've got this much performance to play with, which is more than before, so we could push harder now and use the tyre a bit more aggressively in line with everybody else, or we could probably afford to nurse the tyre a little bit more, still have fantastic performance, and that gives us the shot of a different strategy. And I think actually Suzuka was a brilliant example of both, because Sainz beat McLaren by 10 seconds at a track where Ferrari were, 20 odd seconds behind McLaren last year on a conventional strategy. That was the conventional strategy for the race. And Leclerc went from 8th to 4th and was actually mildly disappointed he didn't get a podium by being able to pull up a one stop. And that Ferrari is not doing either of those strategies as competently as that a year ago.
Yeah, and that Leclerc strategy was born of good pre-planning options, and also Leclerc playing a very active role in pushing them down that road as well, which hasn't always been the case. I think one area where, independent of the car improvement, because everything you said there is the primary factor, but they seem to have stopped doing these completely all over the place things, like Interlagos 22 in Q3. Remember when they sent Leclerc out on intermediates, and Sainz ended up going out on slicks, but only because he'd had basically an argument with the pit wall about it. Said, no, this is what it is. And then just things compounded because he ended up then being held up by Leclerc, who was struggling on the intermediates coming out of the pits and everything. So those ludicrous messes, or sending out cars on wets on a dry track in qualifying, that happened to Suzuka a few years ago, didn't it? Maybe about 5 years ago now. But those complete ball dropping things seem to have gone as well, where they've just, rather than running with it, they've just dropped everything because they've got it completely wrong. The next question now we'll aim at you, Josh. Chris Shaw, this is a very popular topic on the podcast. We've had loads of questions about this in general. Given the continuation in his lacklustre form since his time at McLaren, how much longer are Red Bull willing to give Daniel Ricciardo an F1 seat with a perfectly suitable replacement waiting in the wings in Liam Lawson?
Yeah, I'd like to see Lawson get a chance at some point. I think he did a really good job in his stand-in performances last year, so he's a great pick. But yeah, it's a case of who's going to make way, and Ricciardo's obviously not started the season in the best way. I thought his Suzuka weekend was an improvement. In qualifying, he was really close to Tsunoda. Unfortunately, ruined it a bit in the race. I think it was a misjudgment a little more on his side, but I do agree that it was a first lap racing incident. But then we couldn't see, can he carry on that improvement that he showed in qualifying into the race? So I think he's still got a little bit more time, but probably not very much. Red Bull is rarely one to give a driver too much patience, even one of their favoured sons like Ricciardo. So yeah, he's still got a little bit more time, but I really wouldn't rule out a mid-season switch if nothing changes. And as they showed last year, that doesn't even mean waiting until the summer break.
Yeah, there was a nice little improvement for him at Suzuka, so all is not lost. But I think the trouble is that there's two things going on with how we're evaluating Ricciardo. One, you've got his performance relative to Tsunoda, but then there's also the performance relative to what he needs to be a top team driver, or to be back at his absolute best. When he was a couple of times in 14 and 16, as we said before, you can make a very strong case that he was the best driver in Formula One that year in terms of his performances. So yeah, that getting close to Tsunoda's one thing, or getting on top of Tsunoda's one thing, but yeah, you need to see a lot more from Daniel Ricciardo to be convinced by him. You want to give him every chance because he was so good, but history only gets you so far.
Well, it hasn't been completely hopeless, has it? There's been plenty of flashes that he's got, something there. It's just, can he get it together quick enough? And the other question is, what does Red Bull, as we've said many times, what does it actually want from that second team? Does it want someone of the experience of Ricciardo to be, a figure there kind of leading the team, or is it purely to look at potential candidates for the senior team? It's a question that I think just gets murkier and murkier, and I think whatever they do with Ricciardo and Lawson in particular, and obviously the drivers below Lawson who are, wanting to get a seat, they haven't promoted anybody like that for a long time into a full-time seat. So I think that question's going to be an interesting one, which we'll get an answer to at some point this year, inevitably.
And connected to that, a question I'll take from Morgan, who says, I'm just wondering about your thoughts on who you think would fill in an RBR seat if Verstappen or Perez were unable to race. It seems like the team would want it to be Ricciardo, but surely Tsunoda has done enough that he should get the call-up. Yeah, it's a good question. Technically speaking, Liam Lawson's the Red Bull reserve driver, so he's on standby and he's usually hanging around the place. However, as we know, your reserve driver might not necessarily be the one you slot in. And the implication of the question is that Red Bull would likely grab an RB driver, with Lawson probably taking their place. And I agree, that's likely how it would go. At a guess, I think Red Bull would probably chuck Daniel Ricciardo in, because that would give them the chance to evaluate him in that car in a competitive situation. Plus, he knows the team of old. If you pick on performance, it'd be Yuki Tsunoda, of course. You could make an argument he'd be less well suited to the pressure, given his self-confessed struggles with the emotional control. But what a great test of that as well. So I would say you would put Tsunoda in there and Lawson takes the RB seat for a weekend. But I do think Red Bull would go Ricciardo. It'll be down to the exact circumstances and timing, but that's how I predict it would probably play out.
I doubt they'd put Tsunoda in just because they don't see him as a serious full-time driver there. I think they'd, like you say, use it as an audition. Honestly, I think they would even be tempted to put Lawson straight in the Red Bull just as a, Ferrari put Ollie Behrman in. He absolutely excelled. Why not see what Lawson can do in a Red Bull? We know he can perform in the second team, thrown in. He did last year. Why can't he do it in the senior team?
It'd be great to see, wouldn't it? What do you think, Scott?
I think it would be a good sink or swim moment because we know that that's something that Red Bull, especially someone like Helmut Marko, likes from the young drivers. And it would just, when they've got as much data as they have from RB itself, it would just be a really interesting thing for Lawson specifically. And it would just be a great reference for Red Bull Racing in that regard. Then they know, because they know so much, they know everything about Lawson and Ricciardo. Tsunoda and Ricciardo. Lawson is the one with more unknowns and question marks. And then when you're sort of considering about what to do in a post-Sergio Perez world, I think it would be very beneficial for Red Bull to know whether or not they actually have a really good young driver of their own that they're maybe not considering. Whether that's for Red Bull Racing or RB longer term, who knows? But I just can see it being the kind of thing that they'd learn a lot from. And it would be a very classic Red Bull way of dealing with it, rather than perhaps being the slightly confused, we don't really know if any of our drivers are any good version of Red Bull that we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, there's an argument for it, certainly, and I'd like to see it, but I still feel that with everything that's going on, they'd lean towards Ricciardo, but who knows? Hopefully for Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez's sake, I hope they don't need to, but yeah, as we saw in Saudi Arabia, anything can happen. Josh, a question for you from Gareth Moore, who says, another last place for Logan Sargent at Suzuka. With Williams removing him in Australia in order to increase the chance of getting points with Albon and giving him the repaired chassis for Japan, what's the reason for keeping him in the seat for the rest of the season? I'm not sure what other options they have to replace him, but if points are that important to the team, why keep him in the seat? Sponsorship?
Well, he's a very valued member of the team. Obviously, there were plenty of reasons why they kept him in the seat for this year, and I don't think sponsorship was at the top of it. You could argue the lack of better alternatives was the top one, and that would obviously be a similar situation even now. There's not an obvious candidate on the sidelines, so you would chuck in and would be an obvious replacement. Obviously, Andrea Kimi Antonelli was kind of earmarked for that seat for next year before Hamilton's Ferrari move, so you could argue once he turns 18, second half of the year, chuck him in for a few races, but obviously he's got a proper program in F2 and a proper test plan, and throwing him might be a bit of a risk both for Williams and Mercedes. So I think much like the end of last year, at the moment, all signs point to Sargent keeping that seat at least for this year, because he is still highly rated by the team. They still know he's got plenty of potential. He's unfortunately just not realising it anywhere near as much as he needs to keep his seat beyond this year. But in terms of this year, without an obvious candidate, I can't see any change happening for now.
Yeah, and the bottom line is ultimately he's in that seat for lack of good alternatives. Obviously, when he got the seat, he was not the first choice because Williams were pursuing Oscar Piastri, obviously. Part of the whole Alpine thing was they planned to place him with Williams for a year or two and then put him into the main team. Obviously, that then didn't happen. And then they were looking at someone like Nick de Vries, but then Red Bull came in for him, ill-fatedly, but that took him off the table. So Sargent was just around in their driver scheme and had shown enough potential because, as we've said many times, Sargent has got speed in him, but he just can't string it all together. As I understand it, I don't think there's any emphatic sponsorship imperative to have him in that seat. However, they do a lot of commercial work in the US. They've got a commercial office in New York and they're really trying to tap into that market. And Sargent has been used in some of their North American stuff. Duracell, for example, used it in his USA advertising campaign a bit. Not because he's a big name, because I don't know where Logan Sargent ranks in the names of famous American sporting stars in terms of the recognition in the country, but I imagine he's pretty low down. But just it plays well in America just to have an American, even if you've never heard of them. So he's useful from that perspective, but I don't think it's rock solid and locks him in. But ultimately, I didn't buy the stuff about it showing a lack of confidence in him by putting Albon in his car. Because if they were completely out of confidence, there was any chance they would have dropped him because they'd have had to. But they, I think, see what we've seen, which is a driver. There's potential and pace there, but he struggles to string it together. I'm not convinced he ever will because we've had quite a big sample set now, but there's still the chance. So, yeah, he was in some ways fortunate to get that seat. He's been fortunate to keep it. His luck will run out eventually, but I don't think you can say Williams haven't given him a good crack of the whip, to be quite honest. He's had a great F1 opportunity.
Also, there is a big difference between the faith in keeping him for a second season when the options are limited to the specific scenario of the Australia weekend. Like that, those are.
Yeah.
It isn't the same equation. You're looking for a driver that can basically be hopefully a solid number 2 to Albon, who's your clear lead over the entirety of a season and will hopefully make a step over the entirety of that season as well. It's not just going to be that they didn't expect Sargent to be at race 1 what he needs to be by race 24 in 2024. So versus the Australia weekend, which is unfortunately in the moment it's a very binary which driver is our best chance of getting points, and that is Albon. And it does speak to a certain lack of faith from Williams in that they don't believe that Sargent is as good an option as Albon is over one single sample set or one single situation in which you're banking on a points finish. That's off the back of 15 months of Albon proving he's much better than Sargent as a Grand Prix driver, but that's not the same.
That is a universal opinion, I think. I don't think anyone can build a credible case. That's not correct.
No, and it's probably the least incorrect I've ever been on one of these podcasts.
That's the best kind of correct.
Yeah, and so yeah, I share your point, Ed. I don't think it's the same as not having any faith in Sargent and then fundamentally undermining his position in the team. I mean, we all knew that it didn't change anything because we all knew that he was unlikely to be kept on if they have a legitimately better option to replace him with.
And they had no better options last year, but I'll absolutely bet my house on it, even though I don't own one, that there will be better alternatives if he doesn't improve his level at the end of this year. The amount of drivers that are ready for F1 and the amount of seat swapping that's going to ensue, without an improvement, there's just no way I think he can continue for a third season.
But he's got every chance. He's in the car. He can deliver. If he delivers in the car, he will be kept on. He's got to up his game to do that. I'm not convinced he will, but there's still something in there that might coalesce. But I think we're in the realms of hope rather than expectation when it comes to that. But good luck to him. Right, on to our final batch of questions now. Josh, first up for you. Oscar Robledo says, my question following the Japanese Grand Prix is, given the variability of tyre strategies and the effect that this had on on-track racing, with everything coming together at the end, is there an argument to force the drivers to use all 3 tyre compounds during a race, or will the engineers and strategists get on top of the variability and coalesce around an optimal strategy at each race?
Yeah, the engineers would figure this out in no time. Maybe there'll be a couple of weekends of chaos or variation, and they'd all converge on what is easily the best strategy. Those further down would obviously try something different, or occasionally a safety car or a red flag or something would throw a different variable into the mix. But yeah, for me, this is not a good idea, because I think it would be enjoyable and interesting for all of one weekend, and then after that, it would just get dull. I think that would actually compromise some of the good races we've had in the last couple of years. If you forced the drivers to use all the compounds, it would ruin some of those good races, and it wouldn't particularly improve many of the flatter ones.
Well, Japan, it would have eliminated some of the variability because Leclerc couldn't have one-stopped, Mercedes wouldn't have attempted to one-stop, Magnussen wouldn't have done his long first stint approach. So I always think with strategy, the more stipulations externally you put on it, the more convergence you're going to get, because you're narrowing the band of what can be done.
And it's just not as natural, is it? Or kind of, it's almost against the ethos.
You've always got to factor in
taking the tyres to the limit, or kind of being a proper test of
what are the circumstantial
driver
ones.
and machine and tyres. It just feels that step too artificial, and yeah, like I say, would probably get dull after the first couple of weekends.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's better ways to do it. And ultimately, also, good racing comes from good variables between a tight bunch of teams. And I think, interestingly, with Formula One at the moment, if Red Bull hadn't been there the last couple of years, then people would be talking about it as a classic, because we have this variability in that group behind generally. And in fact, I think people are saying, oh, this year's a bit predictable now because Ferrari's always doing all the winning. It's not Red Bull's fault. Red Bull's doing its job. Well done to them. But you've always got to factor in what are the hard variables that are actually having an influence and what are the circumstantial ones. Next up for you, Scott, a question from Hamish McDonald, who says, should the DRS detection zone be modified to prevent a scenario whereby a car that has just been overtaken gains the advantage of DRS immediately after? For instance, if Perez overtakes Norris into the chicane, should Checo then have DRS?
I think I understand the point just from a I guess sort of sporting fairness element, in that in the situation he's outlined, Checo's the one who has been in position to gain the DRS. But why? But then if we have it that way, because I think there are a few DRS zones that have it so that the overtaking car retains DRS down the next straight, for example, you just kill racing. There's no way of coming back, because if you look at I'm going to draw a massive blank now in terms of like where you overtake someone and then don't, and then you get the DRS down the next straight.
Bahrain's
anyway.
a good example.
Bahrain was one I was thinking of. You can't then, the overtaking car can't then tuck back into the slipstream and then attack them down the straight into the next corner, because as soon as they pull out of the slipstream, the car that's in front is going to have the DRS and it's going to pull clear. So I don't like it. I think on the situations where you have one straight leading into the next, and when both straights do have the DRS activation area, I think you either have to have it where the chasing car gets so the DRS zone resets basically before the next straight, or it's the car that's now in front is ineligible for, so the DRS just doesn't activate. So you have to be behind a car to be able to use the DRS. Just otherwise, I just think we are in a situation where you can't come back at the car that's just gone past you. And DRS is meant to be an overtaking aid that then allows you to contest the braking zone. It isn't then meant to be for you to send it in one corner and then use the DRS to then scamper away down the next straight.
Yeah, it's very difficult, because whatever rules and regime you put on it, there's never a perfect solution. There's always some positives and negatives, and track configuration plays a part. So yeah, you can make arguments for any sort of basis. I think probably there's a bit more they can do with the DRS to, as you say, create those contested braking zones by tuning the length of the DRS zone. But they seem to have given up on that lately. It's something they did a bit more in the earlier years. Question now from Tim Walters, who says, at the post-race weigh-in, the drivers are handed a slip of paper by the FIA official. What is it? What becomes of it? And why are the drivers, especially those going to the champagne-soaked podium, responsible for it rather than a team rep? I really like this question because I didn't know the answer to it, because I'd not noticed it happening, largely because I pretty much never see what's going on in part for me, because I'm down in the paddock, or if not, you're head down doing something. So podiums and part for me, the things I almost never ever see, funnily enough. But yeah, that slip of paper is handed to them after they've been weighed, and this happens after qualifying in the races and sprints for that matter. The drivers are weighed in order to check everything is compliant with the minimum weight regs that includes drivers. It's been like that since I think the mid-90s. They've done that weighing to stop you doing anything sneaky, and that little piece of paper does indeed record the weight, and it's done just to confirm the driver accepts the weight reading and there's a record of it, so they keep hold of it. It means if there is a disqualification, you can't say, oh, hang on a minute, when we were weighed I saw this on the screen, not that, but it's right, it's written down, you accept it, you've got it. So it just means if there is any weight related exclusion, there's evidence of it, and it's just a little procedural thing. They actually do it for all drivers. It's not just the top three, but we always will see it in the top three if you're watching the part from A, because they're the ones who are on the screen. Next question for you, Josh, from Kevin Twomey, who says, between the impacts of the cost cap and the convergence of car performance across all 10 teams, do you think the day of the pay driver might be coming to an end? Carrying a subpar driver previously cost you a few places, which justified the extra sponsorship or investment a pay driver brought. But with the grid now so much tighter, these drivers are getting found out to such a degree and costing teams so much prize money that it doesn't look like it's worth the income they might bring in.
I think the day of the pay driver has already ended in effect. I was thinking back to who I would class as the last kind of pay driver. You could look at Nikita Mazepin at Haas, Nicholas Latifi arguably at Williams, where that sponsorship came into effect. And obviously when Latifi's performance relative to Albon in 22 was such that obviously Williams then looked elsewhere. And obviously the part of that was because they were in a better position financially, but also partly because they knew they needed some better results from the second car. So I think it has, in a way, ended 95% of the time. I think there will always be an element of it, because if a team gets into unexpected financial difficulty, which can still even happen to one of the current teams through any variety of reasons, then they will inevitably have to turn to somebody with slightly more backing. So I'm not convinced it will 100% end, but I think the era of pay drivers as we used to know it is well and truly gone. And really, it's more kind of exceptions to the rule than the kind of litany of pay drivers we used to have, say, 20 years ago.
Joe's a pay driver, though, in the I think pretty much in a conventional sense as well. He's in that seat for commercial reasons. He's not in that seat for sporting reasons. And I say that as someone who thinks that Joe's a very capable driver, and I don't think he doesn't discredit himself or anything like that. It's not that he's a good kind of pay driver in that he's still a credit to the F1 grid and still deserving of a place on it. You know, he's a good quality driver, and I think that is that's the bit that I would agree with most from what Josh was saying there. I think that the caliber of driver who is on the grid for other reasons than just, wow, this driver's brilliant, is higher than it's ever been. The basement level of the F1 grid, I think, is a lot higher now than it has been, because you're, if you take it as a pay driver is someone who brings commercial benefits to the team, then Lance Stroll is a pay driver in that effect as well. But he's also a European F3 champion. Joe is a race winner at every category he's ever competed in, right up to and including F2. So that's a good level of driver, you know. And so it's not offensive by any means, but I think we still have a little bit of a way to go, because I don't think F1 will ever have a grid populated by the 20 best drivers in the world. I just don't think it's really possible, to be honest. There's too many drivers that fall off along the way, and drivers that you might just have misalignment or whatever. So I don't think it is ever the 20 best drivers in the world in Formula One. Are we closer than we've ever been? Maybe. But the good thing is that the super license rules to a degree have helped, but the increasing competitiveness of the championship, as sort of outlined in the question, has sort of nudged it over the line as well. So the good thing is we're way past the era of the no-hopers sneaking onto the grid.
Yeah, very much so. I think those super license points as well, I think there are a couple of likely candidates who got up to sort of F2 level who had very good backing, who I think probably would have got into an F1 race seat at some point in the past 7 or 8 years, were those regulations not in there. But now the financial strength of the teams also plays against that. A question for you now, Scott, from Trish and Clay Woolcock, who says, as a long-time Stewart Jaguar Red Bull racing fan and a fan of Mr. Newey, I'm loving the design genius of Red Bull dominating in F1. However, I'm also keenly aware that this kind of dominance will drive people away from F1. Could a tyre war be the answer? There's competition in every other area of F1, and it could allow for a degree of unpredictability. And the increase in mechanical grip from the tyres developed in a tyre war could allow for significant reduction in aero grip for the next rule set in 2026, keeping the same grip level overall but increasing mechanical grip while reducing aero grip. It can't make the racing any worse than what we've seen this year, surely.
I think do you remember we did a podcast, didn't we, Ed, last year, where we sort of got into this in quite a lot of detail about the merits of a tyre war when Bridgestone was interested in going for the tender against Pirelli. And I think the conclusion we kind of tentatively came to was that if you came up with the right conditions, this is perhaps the kind of best opportunity to go back to that. But it's just fraught with a lot of potential unintended consequences that could have negative impacts on F1. You do risk then, some kind of one-sided team tyre supplier relationship. Again, it would come down to the way you regulate it. But would it make things worse? Not necessarily. I don't think there's any. I'm just trying to think through everything in real time now. Nothing's jumping out to me as a cast iron reason why the racing would have to get worse in a tyre war. I agree that there would be a good competitive. There could be a good competitive step in terms of the performance profile of the tyres and the impact that has on racing. And maybe it would work if you aligned it in some kind of regulatory change where you impacted what the tyres had to achieve strategically. Because I think, rather than it just being a single supplier issue, the worst thing that's happened to F1 in the last sort of decade or so tyre-wise is how everybody's converged on the drive around on track at the lowest possible speed with the lowest number of pit stops, because it's just it's more prevalent than ever. In my opinion, that's a bit anecdotal. I don't know if the data genuinely backs me up on that, but I just feel like the strategic variance is at an all-time low, and that is in part because the time loss with extra pit stops and the inability to overtake and the setbacks that you get from pushing the tyre and blah, 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 means that everything's just limited from that point onwards, including the tyres. And if you were to align it with, I would be more in favour of a regulatory change anyway, but if you had it so that you had a minimum number of pit stops, you mandated the use of all three tyre compounds, whatever it was, I'd be a bit more in favour of something like that, because I think you can control the parameters there a lot more easily than you can a tyre war.
Yeah, that's very true, although the more parameters you put in, the more you corral people into one position. I think ultimately the whole thing about the way races are managed is just because people understand it more. They understand more what they get out of the tyres. You can control that much, much better, and that will always, people don't like this thing of efficiency versus speed, but speed is efficiency, and the way to complete the race in the fastest possible time is to maximise that efficiency. So yeah, one thing I would say though is that although there is a way you can get more grip out of the tyres, and I'm sure if there was a tyre war that would accelerate the development and you get more grip. I think if you're ever going to expect mechanical grip to offset aerodynamic grip, there's decades to tell us that won't happen. Aerodynamic performance is overwhelmingly far and away more than what you can get out of the mechanical grip. It's just the way that it is ultimately. If you're going to have super fast race cars as F1 cars are, they're always going to be aero dominated to a greater or lesser extent. You can nudge up the mechanical grip a bit with the tyres, but I don't think you're going to transform anything, let's put it that way. Question for me now from Adam Barton, who says, could the Japanese Grand Prix be a case study for Pirelli to target in terms of tyre wear like Canada 2010 with multiple strategies creating constant on-track action? Yes, insofar as it's a race that delivered on Pirelli's objectives, which is all three tyre compounds were usable and there was a divergence of strategies. But there's a number of very specific circumstantial factors that mean this isn't actually that useful a case study, because those factors were the disrupted practice without wet FP2 and then to a lesser extent a bit of time lost in FP1 to the Logan Sargent red flag. There was the other confounding factor in that Sunday was a lot warmer than Friday and Saturday as well, so they were already down on tyre data and then the conditions swung significantly. There's always something you can learn, but I think it's difficult to apply any clear lessons from Suzuka other than it's more interesting when this happens. And I've got a bit of sympathy for Pirelli because they have to provide a tyre that can create strategic variety across 24 circuits using just 5 slick compounds. And they've got to be completely safe and not too marginal in terms of whether they'll have structural failures, etc. You've got to know the C1 compound can handle anything in terms of the loads, and obviously Suzuka is at that upper limit in terms of what it takes out of the tyre. So it is very, very difficult. And obviously even Canada 2010, which did inspire the desire for multi-stop races because it was an oasis of multiple stops in a sea of one stoppers that year. But that was circumstantial as well because it was a smooth track surface. They weren't loading up the tyre to deform the tyre to get the energy into it. So the tyres were sliding and you were getting graining, you were getting accelerated deg. So it was a specific set of circumstances in how you achieve that. So yeah, it's a case study because it's a nice thing to work towards, but I don't know how you'd replicate those conditions in the future in a meaningful way unless you can control the weather, which unfortunately is beyond even Stefano Domenicali at this time. Well, thanks to Scott and Josh for those excellent answers, and also thanks to everyone who sent in a question. There's lots more to listen to from our other podcasts, including And Colossally, That's History, an all-new production featuring Richard Williams and Matt Bishop, so that's well worth checking out. And for your viewing pleasure, do have a look at our YouTube channel and check out our website. We'll be back with more on Monday, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.